Welcome to another episode of Going Homesteady. I hope you were with us last time when we had took the occasion to talk about what we called agrarian oxymorons. Uh, were specifically tools that kind of come out of complicated, interconnected, uh, free market capitalist contexts that actually free us from having to be so connected to those contexts. And in that conversation, we talked about that old odd adage, does a fish know that it's wet? In which I talked about there are all sorts of things about our world that seem normal to us because it's all that we've ever experienced, but which aren't actually historically normal. And I want to continue down that particular thread on today's episode, considering specifically how it is that we own property. We've said before on this program that the land that we're cultivating here, that we're trying to homestead on, is land that we purchased in a land auction. The auction happened because the family that had farmed here for many, many years, uh, the older generation had passed on, and the younger generation wasn't especially eager to farm the land. And in fact, the land that we bought is connected with land that used to belong to, maybe still does, to the family of the brother of the gentleman who farmed here. And interestingly, these two brothers who had these two pieces of land also happened to marry two sisters. And So we bought this at an auction. It wasn't a government auction, it was a private auction. It was just ready to sell, and that's how they decided to sell it. And I mean, the story of how we came to get this land, I think I'm going to have to wait till Lisa is with us to talk about it. It's an amazing story. But I mention it today because there are different ways to get land, and we could have, it might have been what we would call a state or a sheriff's auction. How does that happen? Well, that happens, friends, because the reality is, however much we might like to believe that we own land, we don't. I tell people all the time that every one of us is a renter, and people, so pleased with themselves that they're homeowners or landowners will say, well, I'm not a renter, I'm an owner. And I say, well, what would happen if you stopped paying your rent? Here's what happens if you landowners stop paying their rent. They get kicked off their land and their land gets sold. So who is the landlord of our land? Well, we've talked about these folks before. I'm not a big fan. It's the government. It's the state. They're the ones who require of us every year that we pay for the right to continue to live on our land or use our land or farm our land. We've got to pay them to be able to continue to do that. That's not always the way it's been. There was a time when most land was more, what's the word for it? More clearly, more overtly, more uh, knowingly owned by the government and more clearly rented by those who lived on the land. This was a system that we call feudalism. Feudalism. And under feudalism, in principle, the king owned all the land. And the king put over pieces of land, uh, nobles of various kinds, and gave them authority over the land, but they taxed them too. And then these nobility would put the peasants on their farms, and they would charge them rent to be able to stay on those land holdings. So this is how it was done in Europe during the Middle Ages, this feudal system. And it was a very rare thing for a private citizen to actually own their own land. Interestingly, one private citizen that owned his own land uh, despite not being nobility back in the day, was a gentleman by the name of Hans Luther. And Hans Luther had a young son whose name was Martin, who became Martin Luther, the father of the Reformation. Martin Luther's dad was a non-noble landowner, which was a pretty rare thing. Well, in between this feudal system and the system that we live under now, there was a time when people could actually own their land. In fact, you could Google this if you wanted to. The way that we describe what it means to own land in our day is we own land through what's called the fee simple system. FEE, simple, just like Simple Simon, the fee simple system. Now, I don't know the first thing about where it got that name, except I do know this: we got to pay a fee, or we simply won't be allowed to stay. Okay, the fee simple system is what I described. It's what we live through. That we sort of own our land, but really the government has the ability to kick us off our land if we don't pay our rent, which we call property taxes. The other kind of actual ownership, where it's yours free and clear, and there is no ongoing debt. It's almost like how people who when they borrow money to buy their land or their home and they pay off that mortgage, it's a very common thing for people to have a mortgage burning ceremony where you take your paperwork for your mortgage and you light it on fire, and it's, yay, we paid it off, and that's a great thing, and I'm very happy for that. But you can't do that with property taxes. There is no end. It's not like you've borrowed money from them and once you pay it back, they won't come around for more. It is perpetual and goes on forever. Well, allodial ownership is actual ownership. It is spelled Allodial, allodial ownership. Now, believe it or not, you can actually do that in this day and age, but it is profoundly complicated and very rare, and you have to jump through all sorts of hoops. And as you might imagine, the government's not eager to help you do so. They will put up every barrier they can. I don't know that when the last time it's been done, where it's been done, probably somewhere out in the wilds of Wyoming or something like that. Maybe there's somebody out there who has allodial title to his land, but it's virtually non-existent. So what does that tell us? Well, it goes back to what we talked about in an earlier episode about the state seeking to sit upon God's throne. In fact, let me actually, in a sense, speak well of fee simple, because the truth of the matter is, ultimately, none of us own anything. Not because the government owns everything, but because, well, the ultimate government owns everything. Everything belongs to God. He not only owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he owns all the hills and all the cattle. He owns every grain of sand, every bit of dirt, every micro or every atom, every subatomic particle. It all belongs to him. And going all the way back to the garden, that was true. And God assigned to Adam and Eve the task of what we call being his vice regents. Vice regent. We're used to that word vice president. A vice regent comes from the word regent, which means king. So it is the vice regent is the king under the king. God is the ultimate king, and he gives the garden and the whole world in stewardship to Adam and Eve. And he says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to dress and keep it. I want you to protect it and guard it. I want you to exercise dominion over it. When, for instance, God establishes the tithe, when we give back to him 10%, we're not paying tax. What we're doing is acknowledging that it's all his. The 10% is a symbol of everything that we have, and recognizing and giving back, we're recognizing and affirming to God, we know this is all yours. Now, does that mean you can't enjoy it? No, of course it doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. It does mean you're supposed to enjoy it in light of and in the same manner that God calls you to. You have to do it under his authority, under his law. You're not going to be able to enjoy it while you're doing things that are defying his authority. So understand what's happening here. Understand that in terms of going homesteady, in terms of being a homesteader, what we're trying to do is go back to the garden, to recognize that this land is God's land. Yes, we do pay our taxes. You know why we pay our taxes? Because God commands us to. Not because the government commands us to. What do we care what they say? We do it because God commands us to. We're doing it as unto him, just like we do our work as unto him. Okay? He is the one we're under. We are citizens of his kingdom. And in his kingdom, he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In his kingdom, in Romans 13, he says, pay your taxes. Taxes to whom taxes are due. Honor to whom honor is due, etc., etc. So while I'm here to tell you it's a horrible, awful thing that the government thinks that it has the authority and the right to tax God's land, at the same time, I'm not here to say stop doing it, because God says pay it. And we can do so from a posture of trust, from a place of knowing we're in good hands, because as the word itself tells us, all these governments, no matter how wicked they are, they're all under his control. Every last one of them. Isn't it interesting that when Paul writes the letter to the church at Rome, in which in Romans 13 he says, submit to those in authority over you, for every authority is sent from God, they are God's minister of justice, that he writes this to the citizens of Rome. In the Roman Empire, they were brutally totalitarian. They were awful. And Paul says to those under them, obey them. So we can manage. We can not be afraid. We can trust in the Lord. We can pay our property taxes, and we can recognize that our land doesn't belong to us. It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the true and living God. We need to have that mindset, and every day when we're out and we're working in the land, when we're digging up the ground to plant, when we're pruning our fruit trees, when we're caring for all the animals, we're doing this as God's stewards. And by the way, we have quite a number of stories in the Bible of how God blesses and prospers those who steward well under the authority even of wicked leaders. Whether it's Joseph under Potiphar and then under Pharaoh, whether it's Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar. These are situations where stewarding well led to blessings. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, I'm going to ask you to help us steward well our television, or excuse me, our YouTube program. And I'm going to ask you to do it the way I always ask you to do it. I'm going to ask you, if you haven't already, to subscribe. It's not hard. You just hit the subscribe button. And when that happens, it'll send you reminders or notifications every time we have a new episode going up. And that way you won't miss any. I want to ask you also to like what you've seen and keep doing that. You can like each separate episode. You can go back and watch ones you haven't seen before. Like those. All the likes helps in the algorithms that gets us before more people's eyes. We want you to share. Boy, that's really important. If you can go on your social media, whatever social media you use, and put a link to this program and say, hey, I really am enjoying this program. I'm learning so much. I love the fact that it's a conversation and that it's a shared journey. Come along with us. Put that in your own social media and invite people to come alongside. Put a comment. Let's have that conversation or those conversations. All of those things knit us together, help us to enjoy community together, even if it is through screens. It is a blessing. So I'm asking you to please do that. And let's pray that one day the government will recognize, they'll kiss the Son, as Psalm 2 commands. They'll recognize that Jesus is Lord of Lords, and they'll submit to Him and make it so much easier for us to submit to them. We'll see you next time on Going Home Steady.